It was an unusually cold October morning in St. Mary Mead, the sort of morning when the mist seemed to linger on purpose, coiling through the hedgerows and softening the edges of the cottages like a veil. The autumn leaves lay in gold and crimson heaps along the high street, stirred only by the occasional puff of wind or the sound of a milk cart making its early rounds. It was Halloween, though in this quiet corner of England, the festival had always been more about mischievous laughter than menace, until this particular year. At precisely 8:30, Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a delicate china cup before her, steam curling gently from the tea within. Her blue eyes, calm yet perceptive, drifted from the newspaper to the window. Beyond the lace curtains, the village moved at its unhurried pace. Mrs. Bantry's maid could be seen crossing the lane with a basket of apples, and the Reverend Clement's bicycle leaned against the church wall, a sure sign that the vicar was within. "It will rain before noon," Miss Marple murmured, her voice soft as she folded the newspaper. "And something else too, I fancy." A small, knowing smile flickered on her lips. Miss Marple was not one for superstition, but years of observing human nature had given her a peculiar sense, an intuition that often whispered to her when ordinary folk missed what was plain to see. And this Halloween morning, that quiet whisper seemed louder than usual. The day's excitement was meant to be the annual harvest and Halloween fete at Old Havisham Manor, the sprawling estate at the edge of the village. Once belonging to a long line of dignified Havishams, it was now owned by Sir Reginald Blunt, a retired colonial officer with an intimidating moustache and a fondness for giving orders even to the gardener. Sir Reginald and his young second wife, Lady Caroline, had recently taken to hosting events meant to restore the spirit of the community, though most villagers suspected it was more about restoring the family's reputation after whispers of gambling debts and marital tensions. By 10 o'clock, the village green was alive with bustle. Stalls lined the path, selling toffee apples, homemade jams, and knitted scarves. The air smelled of damp leaves and freshly baked buns. Miss Marple, wrapped in a soft grey shawl and clutching her umbrella, made her way through the crowd with quiet amusement. She paused to exchange greetings, a nod here, a kind word there, until she came face to face with Inspector Craddock, who was visiting his aunt in the next parish. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure to see you," said Craddock, tipping his hat. "I dare say the fete will keep everyone entertained and out of trouble, one hopes." Miss Marple smiled. "One always hopes so, Inspector, but I've found that mischief has a way of slipping in where least expected, particularly when people gather for celebration." Craddock chuckled, though he had learned never to dismiss her gentle warnings. "Let's pray you're wrong this time." By noon, the fete had moved to the gardens of Havisham Manor. The manor itself was a magnificent Georgian house, symmetrical, solemn, and a touch forbidding under the cloudy sky. Its ivy-covered walls and grand oak doors gave the impression that it had seen generations of secrets come and go. Within, the drawing rooms were decked with garlands and pumpkins carved with rather amateurish faces, a novelty that had made the village children quite giddy. Among the guests were the day's principal players. Sir Reginald Blunt, the brusque host, whose booming laugh did little to conceal a streak of arrogance. Lady Caroline Blunt, his elegant wife, 20 years his junior, with a fragile beauty and eyes that seemed to hold some quiet sadness. Dr. Henry Lytton, the village physician, well respected but lately rumoured to be too familiar with Lady Caroline. Mr. Arthur Finch, Sir Reginald's business partner from London, a clever man with shifty eyes and a habit of touching his cufflinks when nervous. Miss Theodora Greaves, the local school teacher, plain, precise, and passionately opinionated about morality and order. Mr. Basil Trent, a charming young journalist visiting from London, said to be working on a book about English village life, though some suspected he sought scandal more than sociology. Miss Marple, seated quietly with a plate of seed cake and a cup of tea, observed the interplay between them all. She noticed the fleeting looks between Lady Caroline and Dr. Lytton, the tightness in Sir Reginald's jaw each time his wife laughed, and the way Arthur Finch kept glancing toward a locked side door leading to the manor's study. Every expression, every hesitation, she catalogued silently. By mid-afternoon, clouds had gathered thickly overhead. The Fayette's mood began to cool as the wind picked up, rattling the pumpkin lanterns. Sir Reginald, determined to keep spirits high, announced a new feature, a spooky treasure hunt around the manor grounds, complete with clues hidden in the old orchard and stables. The guests, half amused and half annoyed, agreed to play along. Miss Marple, however, chose to remain near the house. "My knees are not quite what they used to be," she explained with a twinkle. In truth, she preferred to observe from the sidelines, for it was in moments of unguarded relaxation that people often revealed more than they intended. At 4 o'clock, the game was interrupted by a scream. It came from the direction of the conservatory, sharp, female, and unmistakably real. Guests came running. Lady Caroline was standing by the glass doors, pale as porcelain, pointing inside. There, amid the fallen ferns and overturned pots, lay Sir Reginald Blunt, motionless, his face an alarming shade of grey. A half-empty glass of sherry was on the table beside him. Dr. Lytton pushed through the gathering crowd, knelt, and checked the man's pulse. Then, after a tense silence, he shook his head. "He's gone," he said gravely. "Heart failure, it seems." A murmur rippled through the guests. Lady Caroline swayed slightly, and Miss Marple, stepping forward with gentle hands, helped her to a chair. "Steady, my dear," she said softly. "Take deep breaths." But Miss Marple's eyes, calm and steady, had already taken in the scene, the sherry glass, the faint scent of bitter almonds, the position of Sir Reginald's hand. Her mind worked quietly, swiftly, with the precision of a needle threading truth from tangled cloth. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived, summoned from the Fayette grounds, the conservatory had become a scene of tense whispers. Dr. Lytton stood apart, his expression unreadable. Arthur Finch fidgeted near the window, while Miss Greaves whispered prayers. Only Basil Trent, notebook in hand, seemed inappropriately fascinated. "Heart failure," Craddock repeated, looking uncertain. "Doctor, you're certain?" Dr. Lytton hesitated. "It appears so, though, of course. A proper examination." Miss Marple, still standing quietly by the door, spoke in her gentle, tremulous voice. "If I may, Inspector, the faint scent of almonds is rather peculiar, don't you think? I cannot recall almonds being part of Sir Reginald's luncheon." Craddock turned to her, his brows knitting. "You mean?" "I mean," she said softly, "that cyanide, in certain forms, has quite a similar odor." A hush fell. The doctor paled. Lady Caroline let out a soft gasp. Outside, the wind howled across the gardens, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the conservatory glass. It was no heart failure. Sir Reginald Blunt had been murdered. The body was moved discreetly to the library, and guests were instructed to remain inside the manor. The Fayette had dissolved into chaos. Some whispered that Lady Caroline would not recover from the shock, others that the doctor's attentions had been too personal to ignore. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly in an armchair by the fire, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she watched. The world, she had often said, was a mirror, and people, when frightened, showed their true reflections. Inspector Craddock began his preliminary questions, though he couldn't help glancing occasionally toward Miss Marple, whose calm presence he found both comforting and unsettling. "3 people saw Sir Reginald shortly before his death," he announced. Lady Caroline brought him his sherry. Dr. Lytton was speaking with him in the conservatory about an hour prior, and Mr. Finch, apparently, came to discuss some business papers. Arthur Finch bristled. "It was a routine matter, Inspector. I left him alive and well." Miss Marple spoke softly. "Routine matters are often more emotional than one expects, Mr. Finch. Money, for instance, is such a tiresome cause of unhappiness." He turned red, muttering something about impertinence. The storm outside intensified, and the guests found themselves trapped in the manor for the night. The telephone lines had gone down, and the roads were impassable. The great house, once filled with laughter and light, now felt close and airless, its corridors echoing with whispers. As dusk deepened into night, Miss Marple sat by the library fire, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. She thought of the curious timing, Halloween morning, a village Fayette, a sudden death that might have seemed natural to most eyes, but not hers. There was something deliberate in the way the scene had been arranged. The sherry glass placed too precisely, the smell of almonds faint but undeniable, and above all, the look, fleeting, yet unmistakable, of relief on one person's face when the doctor declared Sir Reginald dead. Outside, thunder rolled across the moors. Inside, Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty. This was only the beginning. For by dawn there would be another death, and before the next sunset, a third. The storm raged on through the night, drumming against the tall windows of Havisham Manor and making the chandeliers tremble. The guests, now prisoners of circumstance, had been gathered into the drawing-room under Inspector Craddock's careful supervision. A fire burned in the hearth, but the air remained heavy, charged with fear, curiosity, and the faint scent of sherry that seemed to linger no matter how wide the windows were thrown. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed chair by the fire, her knitting resting in her lap. She was quite still, her eyes half-lowered, listening, for Miss Marple always preferred to listen, not to words, but to tone, to pauses, to what was not being said. Around her, the uneasy company tried to make sense of the death that had turned their festive day into a nightmare. Inspector Craddock stood before the hearth, making notes. "Until the weather clears, no one is to leave the premises," he said firmly. "The doctor will certify the death in the morning, but given what Miss Marple observed," he paused, glancing towards her, "it's only sensible we proceed with caution." Lady Caroline sat apart, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale and strained. Dr. Litton hovered near her with what appeared to be professional concern, though Miss Marple noticed how often his eyes lingered on her lips rather than her pulse. Arthur Finch paced near the window, muttering to himself about unfortunate timing and misunderstandings. Miss Greaves, the schoolteacher, clutched a small Bible and spoke in hushed tones about the wickedness of mankind. And Basil Trent, the journalist, scribbled eagerly in his notebook, as though the tragedy were a gift from Providence. At last, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "You've a knack for seeing what others don't, Miss Marple. What do you make of it all?" Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, it's far too soon to make anything of it, but I dare say it's rather odd that Sir Reginald should die on such a cheerful occasion, and that the one man who knew precisely which medicines he took should be standing over him when he did." Dr. Litton stiffened. "You can't possibly think—" "Oh, I think nothing," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I merely observe. It's a habit of mine." Lady Caroline spoke suddenly, her voice trembling. "Sir Reginald had been unwell for weeks. His heart, the doctor said." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "The heart is a curious organ, so sensitive, so easily disturbed. I've known cases where the mere sight of someone they distrusted was enough to cause trouble." The doctor flushed, but Craddock intervened. "Let's not leap to conclusions. Dr. Litton, you said you saw Sir Reginald earlier." The doctor nodded stiffly. "Yes, around 2:30. He'd complained of headaches and shortness of breath. I advised him to rest and take no more brandy for the day." "And he followed that advice?" asked Miss Marple. Dr. Litton hesitated. "He promised to. I can't say if he did." Arthur Finch stopped packing. "If I may, Inspector, I saw Sir Reginald shortly after that, around 3. We spoke about a shipment from our London office. He was perfectly well then." Miss Marple's needles clicked again. "You must have seen the sherry glass then." Finch frowned. No, I don't recall any glass." "Ah," Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes brightened slightly. "That is interesting." The storm showed no sign of relenting. By midnight, the household had been assigned rooms and instructed to rest, though no one truly did. Miss Marple, however, requested the smallest guest room near the library, remarking that she preferred the quiet. Craddock suspected, rightly, that she wanted proximity to the scene. As she unpacked her knitting, her mind moved as quietly as her hands. Something about the entire situation tugged at her, the timing, the casualness of the poisoning, the strange calm that had settled over Lady Caroline after the first shock had passed. There was grief, certainly, but also relief. Yes, that was it. A subtle unburdening. At dawn, the rain ceased, leaving the gardens drenched and ghostly under a grey sky. Craddock, having spent a restless night, met Miss Marple in the breakfast room where she was stirring sugar into her tea. "Early as ever, Miss Marple," he said with a tired smile. "I suppose you've been thinking." "Indeed," she said, "and you, I imagine, have been worrying." He chuckled softly. "You know me too well." She sipped her tea. "People rarely poison for pleasure, Inspector. It's an intimate thing, so deliberate, so slow. It usually comes from resentment or fear, or both." "Resentment, you say? Against Sir Reginald there was plenty." He opened his notebook. "We've already heard hints: gambling debts, quarrels with Finch, jealousy with the doctor, disagreements with the vicar over church donations." "Indeed, a most disagreeable man, by all accounts," Miss Marple said serenely. "And yet, even disagreeable men rarely die without a reason more personal." Before Craddock could reply, the door burst open. Lady Caroline stood there, white-faced and trembling. "Inspector, there's been another death." They followed her to the grand staircase. A small crowd had gathered at the foot, whispering in horror. There, sprawled on the landing, lay Miss Theodora Greaves, the schoolteacher. Her spectacles were broken beside her, and a thin ribbon of blood marked her temple. "She fell," Lady Caroline whispered. "I heard the crash." Dr. Lytton bent to examine the body, his expression grim. "Neck broken, instantaneous, I should think." Craddock frowned. "Fell from where?" Basil Trent pointed upward. "From the gallery, there, by the railing. I saw her up there not long ago, muttering to herself." Miss Marple, her face calm but eyes alert, stepped closer. "How odd," she murmured. "I do hope she hadn't gone wandering in the dark." "She was distressed," said Lady Caroline. "Last night she said something dreadful, that Sir Reginald's death was the wages of sin. I told her to rest." Miss Marple bent delicately, adjusting her spectacles. "Her shoes," she murmured, "polished, too polished for this morning, and look, a scrap of paper clenched in her hand." Craddock leaned over as Miss Marple gently prized it open. The fragment bore only 3 words, scrawled hastily in pencil. "He knew everything." Craddock exhaled. "Suicide, perhaps." Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No, Inspector, I've known many suicides. They rarely fall so neatly, and never, I think, in shoes that shine as if they'd been polished by another hand." By noon, tension had twisted through the manor like wire. 2 deaths in less than 24 hours. Miss Marple's gentle eyes missed nothing: the whispered conferences between Lady Caroline and the doctor, the way Basil Trent slipped out to the garden under the pretext of fresh air, the trembling hands of Arthur Finch as he fumbled with his pipe. The coroner's wagon finally arrived from Market Bussing, though the road remained muddy and treacherous. The bodies were removed under tarpaulins, and silence fell over the manor. Craddock, now thoroughly grim, convened a private discussion in the study with Miss Marple. "I'll not hide it," he said. "2 deaths so close together, one poisoned, one fallen, it can't be coincidence." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "It rarely is. Murder, I have found, is like embroidery. Once begun, it tends to form a pattern, and if one stitch is crooked, another must be made to hide it." Craddock studied her. "You think Miss Greaves was silenced?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "she knew something, perhaps too soon and too loudly." Outside, thunder rumbled again. The weather, it seemed, mirrored the mood, dark, oppressive, and full of unspoken threats. Later that afternoon, the household gathered in the drawing-room once more, each face drawn tight with fatigue and suspicion. Craddock asked routine questions, but Miss Marple observed the reactions. Arthur Finch looked sickly, his eyes darting to the door as if calculating escape. Basil Trent was almost cheerful, asking idle questions about cyanide with the curiosity of a novelist. Dr. Lytton avoided everyone's gaze, his composure brittle, and Lady Caroline sat like marble, perfect posture, perfect poise, and eyes as cold as the window glass behind her. When tea was served, Miss Marple leaned toward her, her voice as mild as a grandmother. "Such a dreadful business, my dear, but I cannot help wondering, did your husband ever speak of changing his will?" Lady Caroline's teacup trembled slightly. "No," she said too quickly, "at least not to me." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, but perhaps he spoke to his solicitor, or Mr. Finch. Business partners often handle such matters, I believe." Arthur Finch nearly choked on his biscuit. I wouldn't know." "Of course not," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "but it does make one wonder who gains what when death arrives uninvited." No one spoke after that. Only the ticking of the mantel clock filled the silence. As dusk fell again, Miss Marple stood by the conservatory window, gazing at the rain-slicked gardens where the Fayette decorations still drooped, forgotten. 3 pumpkins, their candles long extinguished, sat in a row by the fountain, hollow, grinning, and eerily human in the twilight. Somewhere deep within the house, a door creaked open, followed by soft footsteps. Miss Marple did not turn, she merely smiled faintly to herself. "So," she whispered, "you're growing desperate, aren't you?" For she knew the pattern now was almost complete, and before the next morning came, one more death would be needed to conceal the truth. The storm had passed, leaving Havisham Manor shrouded in a peculiar stillness. The kind of stillness that follows chaos, too calm, too clean, as though nature herself were holding her breath. The lawns glistened with rain, and the morning sun fought through the mist, throwing ghostly light through the windows. Inside, however, there was no peace. 2 deaths, one by poison, one by fall, had turned the cheerful manor into a house of whispers. Servants moved in silence, doors closed too softly, even the ticking of the hall clock seemed accusatory. And in the midst of it all, Miss Marple sat in the breakfast room, sipping her tea with serene composure. Across the table, Inspector Craddock frowned over his notes. "I don't like it, Miss Marple, not one bit. Every person in this house had reason to want Sir Reginald gone, yet none of the evidence quite fits." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "That's because you're looking for one reason, Inspector, when there may be several. Murder is rarely tidy. It begins in confusion and ends in the same." Craddock sighed. "And what do you make of Miss Greaves? Was she pushed?" "I think," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that she may have been persuaded to go somewhere dangerous by someone she trusted. And that's rather worse, don't you think?" At that moment, the door opened, and Basil Trent, the journalist, sauntered in, his notepad tucked under one arm. "Good morning, all," he said cheerfully. "I do hope we're not having another death at breakfast. I've nearly run out of pages." Craddock glared. "Mr. Trent, I must remind you that you are not here in any official capacity." "Oh, come now, Inspector. A writer merely records life as it unfolds. And this," he gestured broadly at the gloomy room, "is life at its most fascinating." Miss Marple gave him a kind look that was somehow both grandmotherly and piercing, or perhaps death at its most convenient. He chuckled, but she saw his fingers twitch, a small, nervous movement. Writers, she knew, often revealed more in silence than in words. As the morning wore on, Craddock began a round of formal questioning. The remaining household gathered in the drawing-room once more, the great chandelier gleaming overhead like a stern observer. Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, though her attention never strayed from the people around her. First came Arthur Finch, his nerves visibly frayed. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. "I tell you, Inspector, Sir Reginald and I had our quarrels, but they were business, nothing more. He was reckless with money, thought he could gamble his way back to fortune. I tried to stop him." "Stop him how?" asked Craddock. "By making sure certain accounts stayed closed. He didn't like that." Miss Marple looked up. "So you controlled his access to funds?" Finch nodded reluctantly. "For his own good, he couldn't be trusted." "Ah," she said softly, "and yet now that he's gone, you'll find the accounts far easier to manage, won't you?" He stared at her, speechless, then muttered, "That's hardly fair." "Oh, fairness is a flexible thing," said Miss Marple gently. "I find truth much more reliable." Next came Lady Caroline. Dressed in mourning black, she looked every inch the grieving widow, though her composure was almost too perfect, her voice too even. "Sir Reginald was not an easy man," she admitted. "He could be cruel when angry, but I endured it, as any wife must." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Not all wives would agree, my dear, particularly not those with companionship to comfort them." A faint blush touched Lady Caroline's cheek. "If you're implying something improper." I imply nothing, Miss Marple said sweetly. I merely notice that comfort comes in many forms. A kind word, a sympathetic ear, perhaps a doctor's steady hand. Dr. Lytton stiffened from across the room. This is absurd. My concern for Lady Caroline is purely medical. Of course, said Miss Marple mildly, though one wonders what sort of medicine includes moonlit strolls in the rose garden. A silence followed. Craddock's pen scratched against his notebook. Lady Caroline's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came. Then she rose abruptly and left the room, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. When the door closed behind her, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Affection, she murmured, can be as dangerous as hatred, Inspector, sometimes more so. That afternoon, the atmosphere grew heavier still. A messenger from Market Bussing arrived with initial toxicology results. Sir Reginald's sherry contained traces of potassium cyanide, swift, unmistakable, and lethal. Cyanide, Craddock muttered, grimacing. Where would one even get such a thing? Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Garden sheds, perhaps, or a doctor's cabinet. It's surprising how ordinary such things can be in a village. Dr. Lytton's face darkened. If you're suggesting my supplies. I suggest nothing, doctor, she said gently, but your patients might. One never knows what people borrow in confidence. He turned away, jaw tight. Basil Trent smirked. Oh, splendid. A poison bottle in the potting shed, an illicit romance, a dead baronet. We are positively dripping with drama. If only I had my camera. Careful, Trent, said Craddock sharply. Mockery looks rather bad when you're inside the case, not outside it. Inside, Basil's smile faltered. Surely you don't suspect. I suspect everyone, Craddock said, including those who write too much and talk too little truth. The young man paled slightly and left the room without another word. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. He's frightened now, she said softly. That's a good sign. The innocent fear gossip, the guilty fear exposure. Evening fell again, painting the manor in long shadows. The household had become a web of glances and whispers. Servants refused to go upstairs alone. Footsteps echoed where no one claimed to walk. And all the while, Miss Marple moved quietly from room to room, part of the furniture, easily overlooked, yet seeing everything. At supper, she sat beside Craddock, her plate untouched. There's something you should know, she said quietly. The study door was locked when I passed earlier, yet the key, which had been in Sir Reginald's pocket yesterday, now rests in the bowl on the hall table. Craddock frowned. Someone been in there. Yes, said Miss Marple, and more curiously, someone wanted us to know. They went together to the study. The door opened easily. The air within was stale, heavy with the scent of cigar smoke. Papers lay strewn across the desk, financial ledgers, correspondence, and a half-burned letter in the grate. Miss Marple knelt carefully, retrieving it with the tongs. The handwriting was unmistakably Sir Reginald. If anything should happen to me, see that Finch receives nothing. He's ruined me once. He shall not do it again. Craddock exhaled. That settles it. Finch had motive. Miss Marple studied the letter. Yes, but letters can be planted, can't they? Especially by clever hands that wish to see suspicion directed elsewhere. She turned the page, revealing faint smudges along the edge, not ink, but powder. Pale, fine, and glimmering faintly in the lamplight. Face powder, she murmured. Scented. Lady Caroline's shade, I think, a rose-tinted sort. Craddock groaned. Good Lord, are they all guilty? Miss Marple smiled faintly. In small ways, yes, but only one is guilty of murder. Later that night, a scream shattered the uneasy silence once again. Craddock and Miss Marple rushed upstairs to find Basil Trent sprawled across the corridor floor, eyes wide, his face blue-tinged. A half-empty teacup lay beside him. Miss Marple knelt at once, sniffed the cup, and nodded gravely. The same scent, she said, bitter almonds. Craddock swore softly. That's the third. 3 murders, Miss Marple whispered, on Halloween morning, just as I feared. Lady Caroline appeared at the end of the corridor, one hand clutching her robe. What happened? She cried. Miss Marple turned slowly to face her. You might tell us, my dear, you served tea not 10 minutes ago." Lady Caroline's eyes flashed. "Are you accusing me?" "I never accuse," Miss Marple said gently. "I only remember. You see, I recall how Sir Reginald insisted on drinking from the crystal glasses, the ones you said were locked away, and how Miss Greaves was the only one who knew that secret cupboard in the pantry. She must have seen something she shouldn't, perhaps the bottle itself." The widow swayed, her face pale. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," said Miss Marple softly. "You see, my dear Lady Caroline, murder is a most inconvenient secret. It must be tended like a flower, watered with lies, trimmed with fear. But it always grows too large in the end." Craddock stared at her. "You think she killed them all?" Miss Marple's eyes were calm. "No, Inspector, not all. Lady Caroline planted the poison, yes, but someone else pruned the flower before it bloomed too wide. Miss Greaves, poor woman, was silenced not by a wife, but by someone who needed her death even more." "Who?" Craddock demanded. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the doctor's bag on the hall table. "We shall see soon enough." She looked once more at the teacup, the spilled liquid glinting under the gaslight. "3 murders," she said quietly, "3 secrets, and 1 truth yet hidden in plain sight." The manor seemed to exhale, its old timbers groaning in the cold. Miss Marple rose slowly, her gaze distant. "The pattern," she murmured, "is nearly complete." The next morning dawned grey and brittle, as though the light itself had been strained through frost. A hush had fallen upon Little Ashcombe. The village green, once alive with Halloween chatter, lay deserted beneath a thin veil of mist. Miss Marple, wrapped in her grey shawl, took tea in her sitting room while reviewing her neat little notes from the previous night. The truth, she thought, was like embroidery, threads crossing unseen at the back of the canvas, forming a pattern only visible when one turned it over. At precisely 9 o'clock, Inspector Grave arrived at her door. He was brisk, but there was a hint of weariness in his eyes. "Morning, Miss Marple. I must say, this case has tied itself into quite a knot." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Ah, Inspector, but knots are only troublesome until one finds the loop to pull." Grave accepted her offer of tea, setting his notebook beside the cup. "We've verified a few things. The bottle of elderflower cordial contained a trace of foxglove extract, deadly in small doses. The same poison was present in poor Reverend Pierce's tea, and we found gloves with soil traces matching the potting shed at Windermere Lodge. The shed, incidentally, was recently locked, and the key found in Miss Whitby's apron pocket." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Miss Whitby, the vicarage housekeeper, how curious. Tell me, Inspector, was she the one who baked the Halloween biscuits?" "She was," Grave replied, "but that doesn't explain why anyone would wish to kill the Reverend, unless—" he hesitated, glancing at her. "Unless," Miss Marple said, "the Reverend knew something dangerous, perhaps something connected to poor Julia's death." The inspector nodded slowly. "We thought as much. He was uneasy yesterday morning, according to Miss Whitby, said he had to speak the truth, come what may." "Quite so," said Miss Marple softly. "The good Reverend was a man of conscience, and conscience can be perilous company when others prefer silence." A quiet visit to Windermere Lodge. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had persuaded Inspector Grave to accompany her on one more visit, this time to Windermere Lodge, the elegant home of Mrs. Beatrice Linton. The house stood aloof at the end of a gravel drive, its windows gleaming like watchful eyes. Mrs. Linton herself greeted them with exquisite composure, her silver hair immaculate, her pearls perfectly aligned. "Miss Marple, Inspector, how kind. You must forgive the state of things. I've barely slept since those dreadful events." Miss Marple smiled. "Quite understandable, my dear. I only wanted to ask a few small questions, trifles really, but trifles can be most revealing." Mrs. Linton inclined her head, motioning them toward the drawing-room. As Miss Marple entered, her eyes caught a faint smear upon the marble mantelpiece, a streak of dried mud, incongruous amid the polish. Her gaze drifted downward to the hearth rug. There, a single leaf from a foxglove plant had been crushed into the fabric. She did not remark upon it aloud, but her eyes flickered with quiet confirmation. Mrs. Linton, she began, settling into her chair, I wonder had you known Miss Hardcastle long? Oh yes, Julia and I met at the Horticultural Society some years ago. Such a bright, ambitious young woman. Her recent troubles saddened me deeply. Troubles? Miss Marple inquired mildly. Mrs. Linton hesitated, fingers tightening around her teacup. Well, yes, financial ones. I believe she'd invested unwisely. It was something she mentioned in passing. How unfortunate, murmured Miss Marple, though perhaps it was less financial and more emotional. Mrs. Linton's eyes flickered. I beg your pardon. Oh, nothing, said Miss Marple lightly, only that she seemed rather, how shall I put it, disenchanted with the Reverend's sermons of late. She told Miss Whitby as much. Mrs. Linton's composure did not falter, but her knuckles whitened slightly. If you're suggesting. I suggest nothing at all, Miss Marple said, with gentle finality, though one does wonder how many secrets a small parish can hold before one bursts through the seams. At that, Mrs. Linton rose abruptly. If you've no further questions, Inspector, I'm quite fatigued. Grave nodded, apologizing for the intrusion. As they left, Miss Marple turned back for a moment, her gaze lingering on the mantelpiece once more. She said nothing, but her mind was quietly assembling the pattern. The garden paths. That evening, Miss Marple requested one more favor from Inspector Grave. She asked that he gather all the suspects at the vicarage after dinner, Mrs. Linton, Miss Whitby, young Peter Ellison, and Mrs. Forbes. The inspector, though skeptical, agreed. As the lamps were lit and the clock struck 8, the small company assembled in the vicar's parlour. Outside, wind hissed through the yews, rattling the windows like restless fingers. Miss Marple sat near the fire, her hands folded neatly over her lap. I fear, she began softly, that this matter will not be settled by chance. The pattern is quite plain now, once one knows where to look. Mrs. Forbes adjusted her spectacles nervously. You mean you know who killed them, Miss Marple? I do, Miss Marple replied, and I dare say it will surprise none of you that all 3 deaths, Miss Hardcastle, the Reverend, and poor Mr. Ellison, are linked by one common thread. Peter Ellison frowned. You mean the church? Miss Marple shook her head. No, dear boy, by love, or more precisely by love betrayed. A ripple of silence followed. Mrs. Linton's face remained motionless, a portrait of grace. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured and clear. Julia Hardcastle was a clever woman, and as you may know, she had begun tutoring young Peter here in literature. But she also had ambitions. She discovered that Reverend Pierce was not only counseling Mrs. Linton privately, but had come to suspect certain improprieties concerning the late Colonel Linton's estate. Mrs. Linton's lips parted, but Miss Marple went on. Julia confronted her about it. The argument was overheard by Miss Whitby. The next morning, Julia was found dead, poisoned by elderflower cordial she never made herself. Inspector Grave leaned forward. You're saying Mrs. Linton poisoned her? Miss Marple looked serenely toward the older woman. Indeed, the foxglove leaves in her garden gave her the means, and her desperate wish to conceal her late husband's forged accounts gave her motive. But she made one small mistake. When she tidied the vicarage the next morning to appear helpful, she brushed a bit of her own garden soil from her gloves onto the Reverend's study carpet. Mrs. Linton's eyes flashed. That's absurd. Anyone could have. Ah, Miss Marple interrupted softly, but not anyone grows foxgloves in the shade of their south wall. Only you, Mrs. Linton. I noticed them myself 2 weeks ago. Grave rose slowly, and the Reverend. Miss Marple sighed. He meant to tell the truth, and so Mrs. Linton slipped the same poison into his afternoon tea, but she had not reckoned on young Peter, who accidentally drank from the same pot later that day. He was not the target, merely collateral damage. For a moment, there was only the ticking of the clock. Then Mrs. Linton's teacup fell from her hand and shattered upon the hearth. You don't understand, she whispered. Everything I did, it was to preserve my husband's name. The Colonel was already disgraced once. I couldn't endure it again. Miss Marple regarded her with sad kindness. Pride, my dear, can be as poisonous as foxglove, but it never truly preserves, it only delays the decay. Inspector Grave placed a gentle but firm hand on Mrs. Linton's shoulder. She did not resist. Later that night, when the others had gone, Miss Marple lingered in the vicarage. The fire had burned low, casting a faint golden light over the Reverend's old desk. She touched the worn edge of his Bible and sighed softly. So much pain hidden beneath such quiet manners. But then, she thought, evil rarely shouted. It whispered politely, wore pearls, and poured tea with steady hands. As she made her way home through the misty lane, the church bells tolled the late hour. From the distant cottages, one could see faint candlelight flicker behind lace curtains, a sign that, for all its troubles, the village would soon settle back into peace. Miss Marple smiled to herself. 3 murders on Halloween morning, she murmured. Such a dreadful thing, but perhaps, in its way, it has reminded us that even in the gentlest of places, darkness needs only a moment's kindness to be undone. She closed her gates softly behind her and stepped into the warm glow of her sitting room, where a pot of tea awaited, and the knitting lay just where she had left it, patient, untroubled, eternal. The morning after Mrs. Linton's confession dawned with an uncanny brightness. The mist that had cloaked Little Ashcombe for days was gone, and the air carried a crisp, clean scent of frost and smoke. The church bells chimed softly as the village stirred, hesitant, subdued, yet unmistakably alive. Miss Marple sat by her window, a shawl wrapped about her shoulders, the morning paper folded neatly beside her untouched breakfast tray. She wasn't reading it, not really. The printed words blurred into insignificance beside the vivid recollections of the night before. 3 lives lost, 1 woman's quiet despair revealed, and beneath it all, that most tragic of human delusions, that the appearance of goodness can excuse the decay beneath. A gentle knock interrupted her reverie. "Come in," she called. It was Mr. Harper, the postmaster, with a telegram in hand. "Thought this might be important, Miss Marple," he said cheerily. "Inspector Grave asked me to deliver it myself." "Thank you, Mr. Harper," she replied, taking it with her usual polite warmth. The telegram read simply, "Mrs. Lynton in custody, full confession made. Thank you for your help, Grave." Miss Marple sighed softly, folding the paper. "A full confession," she murmured. "Yet how incomplete such things always are. One cannot confess what one has never understood." She rose, poured herself a cup of tea, and gazed out upon the village green. A group of children ran laughing past the duck pond, the same spot where Julia Hardcastle had been found. How strange, Miss Marple thought, that life insists on continuing, even in the wake of tragedy. A visit from Inspector Grave. By mid-morning, Inspector Grave appeared at her gate. He was less brisk today, the burden of formal duty replaced by something more reflective. "Good day, Miss Marple. I owe you an apology and my thanks. I was chasing clues, but you saw what none of us could." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Ah, Inspector, I merely observed what was before us. You see, evil in a village like ours must always wear a familiar face. That is its disguise." Grave nodded gravely. "It's a curious business. Mrs. Linton maintains she never meant to kill the Reverend, only to frighten Miss Hardcastle into silence. She brewed the cordial herself, but had no notion young Peter would touch it." "She tells herself that, no doubt," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea, "but poison, Inspector, is never so discriminating. Once loosed, it finds its own path. In that way, it's rather like malice." He looked at her, half admiring, half uneasy. "Do you ever tire of being right, Miss Marple?" She gave a small laugh. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I am wrong most of the time. Only in murder am I occasionally correct." Grave smiled despite himself. "We've recovered the missing church accounts too. The Reverend was right. Colonel Linton had been diverting parish funds for years, but no one wished to see it. Mrs. Linton must have lived with that knowledge for quite some time." "Guilt and pride make strange bedfellows," Miss Marple said quietly. She feared disgrace more than sin. Such fear can drive the gentlest of souls to dreadful acts. Grave stood, adjusting his coat. Well, I suppose justice has been done. Justice, Miss Marple repeated softly. Perhaps, though I often wonder, Inspector, can justice ever undo what pride has already destroyed? He looked thoughtful, but said nothing more. Afternoon, at the vicarage. Later that day, Miss Marple took a short walk to the vicarage. The garden was half-tended, its paths littered with the last of autumn's leaves. Miss Whitby was there, pruning the roses with nervous precision. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, startled, "I hardly know what to do with myself. Everything feels so hollow." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Change always does, my dear, but you mustn't let sorrow rob you of purpose. Reverend Pierce would have hated to see his garden neglected." Tears welled in Miss Whitby's eyes. He was such a kind man, so patient with everyone. Even when he knew things weren't right with Mrs. Linton, he tried to handle it with grace. "That was his way," Miss Marple said softly. "Grace in the face of deception is a rare gift." Miss Whitby hesitated. "They say she confessed, Mrs. Linton, I mean. I can't understand it, Miss Marple. She always seemed so proper." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Ah, yes, but one learns, after a lifetime in villages, that properness is often a veneer, like good silver that hides the tarnish beneath. What matters is not how one appears to live, but what one hides from one's own conscience." Miss Whitby nodded solemnly. "Do you think the village will ever be the same?" "No," said Miss Marple softly, "but perhaps it will be better. A little truth, even a painful one, can make room for new honesty. The Reverend's successor will have quite a task, but perhaps the Lord enjoys a challenge." An unexpected caller. That evening, as Miss Marple sat mending a pair of gloves, there came another knock. It was Peter Ellison's mother, Mrs. Ellison, red-eyed but dignified. "I wanted to thank you," she said, voice trembling. "If not for you, we'd never have known what really happened to my boy. They might have called it an accident forever." Miss Marple rose and took her hand warmly. "My dear, you mustn't thank me. Nothing I did can mend what was lost." Mrs. Ellison shook her head. "But you gave me peace. That's more than I had before." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Peace comes slowly, Mrs. Ellison, like the thaw after winter. It doesn't restore what's gone, but it softens the ground for what must grow again." The woman nodded, unable to speak, and left quietly. Miss Marple watched her go, the evening light catching the faint steam from the kettle on her hearth. Evening reflections. Later, when the village had settled into its nightly calm, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting. The steady click of her needles filled the silence, rhythmic and thoughtful. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, carrying faint echoes of the Halloween laughter that had once filled the air. Life, she thought, was composed of such moments, joy and sorrow interwoven like the threads of her yarn. One could not have one without the other. Her thoughts wandered back to Mrs. Linton, sitting now in a stark, echoing cell, not the elegant drawing-room she'd once presided over. What must she feel, Miss Marple wondered? Relief, shame, or perhaps nothing at all, the numbness that follows when one's world collapses inward. Yet even in her pity, Miss Marple could not ignore the truth she'd long known, that the gravest sins often wore the gentlest faces. The clock chimed 9. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside, poured herself a final cup of tea, and allowed herself a small smile. The world, she mused, would always need a little watching, and she, for one, was not yet too old to keep an eye upon it. Epilogue: The Lesson of Halloween Morning. A week later, the parish held a modest memorial service for the Reverend Pierce, Julia Hardcastle, and young Peter Ellison. The church was filled, not with pomp, but with the subdued dignity of a village chastened by truth. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her head bowed as the new vicar, a nervous young curate from Bath, read from the Psalms. The words were simple, yet somehow perfectly apt. "Surely he scorneth the scorners, but giveth grace unto the lowly." Afterward, as the congregation filed out, Miss Marple lingered by the lich-gate, watching the golden leaves drift down from the elms. Mrs. Forbes approached her quietly. "Miss Marple," she said, "it's strange, isn't it, how death changes people, even the living, I mean." Yes, said Miss Marple softly. It reminds us of what we so easily forget, that behind every polite curtain and smiling face, there are fears, temptations, and secrets, and that, perhaps, is why compassion is the rarest virtue. Mrs. Forbes looked thoughtful. Do you think there will be another Halloween gathering next year? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, undoubtedly, human beings are dreadfully fond of repeating their mistakes, but perhaps next time they'll take more care with the cordial. Mrs. Forbes chuckled despite herself, and Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. After all, she added, a village without its little follies would be rather dull, don't you think? They parted ways beneath the drifting leaves, the church bells tolling softly in the distance. As Miss Marple made her way home along the quiet lane, she reflected, not on the crimes or the confessions, but on the peculiar resilience of life itself. Even after death, deceit, and disgrace, there remain the comforting rituals of tea, knitting, gossip, and the unending watchfulness of human hearts. For evil, Miss Marple knew, was never vanquished entirely, only kept at bay by the gentle vigilance of those who still cared to notice. And as long as she lived, she would notice, always. She reached her gate, paused to breathe in the chill evening air, and whispered to herself, 3 murders on Halloween morning. What a world, and yet, what a blessing, to still find goodness among the ruins. And with that, Miss Marple disappeared into the warm glow of her little house, as the village settled once more into the deceptive peace of the English countryside.